that's as far as we got with it for a while. So that night, we took it on a couple short test rides up and down the road, just as we figured out the tuning on the carburetor. The camshaft required about 14 degrees of adjustment, I believe, in the timing. So we got that done, and then after we adjusted the carb a little bit, it seemed to be running really, really good. The last pass I made with it was almost perfect. It was responsive. It had plenty of power. It was exactly what I had been envisioning for the Nissan the entire time I've been building it. It was just so perfect. And then all of a sudden, it wasn't. So obviously you guys saw that it was backfiring a little bit when it first started. We figured out that was because of the timing. After we fixed that, and then I had my perfect pass, it kind of started to come back. It kind of started to do it again. Some oil started to leak around the top. I think the first thing we started to try and figure out was the fueling. It seemed like the fueling may have just been over pressurized. We put a pressure tester on the fuel line coming out of the carburetor, and it was way too high. That carburetor is only rated for about 4 to 7 pounds of pressure, and it was getting anywhere between 10 and 16 pounds. It was way too high. The first thing we tried was just a generic Holley fuel pressure regulator. I'll put the link to one, if I can find one again, in the description of the video, and here's the part number for what we ended up using. But it was a pretty simple install. I just mounted it to the wheel well. Most of the problems I had getting that set up, and honestly with the fuel pump in general, was just getting everything to seal up tight, because I ended up having to use a lot of adapters to make everything work. This stuff right here is what I ended up using to seal everything up. I had pretty good reviews online where it wouldn't dissolve in a gas, so it shouldn't end up causing problems later on down the road. I was pretty careful when I put it on to make sure that I was only getting the threads coated in the stuff. Ever since I put it together, I haven't had any clogs in the fuel. I haven't gotten any like weird stuff coming out of the exhaust as a result of it, and I have no more gas leaks. So that stuff seems to be working really well. I recommend it, at least for the time being. I haven't had any problems with it. So definitely use that stuff. I picked it right up at my local Aubuchon over in the plumbing and kind of furnace section. That stuff worked great. So we got the fuel pressure situation remedied, and then it seemed to be working better than it had been. The carb at the very least didn't seem to be getting overloaded now, so I ended up actually driving it around for a day. I took it probably about 10 miles, not big rides, and there was a lot of time in between, but basically just taking it here, there, and everywhere around my local area for the whole day. And then it was no longer having a problem with the fuel. All of a sudden, it started having a problem starting after running for extended periods of time. So I could drive it to wherever I was going, all right, with very minimal issue. But then, if I was to shut it off and try starting it again, it didn't want to start. Like it was struggling when it was hot. Most of the places I was going for the day, I ended up staying there for about an hour or so at a time, wherever I was going. So it didn't end up being an immediate problem that I had to end up having the car towed or anything like that. It was just annoying more than anything for that day, but obviously a symptom of some greater underlying issue that I hadn't figured out yet. At the very least, it didn't seem to be overheating at the time. My oil pressure was good. It just seems to be some weird symptom that I wasn't sure if it was working itself out or not the more I drove it. And it didn't really seem to be struggling, like stopping and idling when it was started. So I figured maybe it was just something that would work itself out eventually. I know sometimes I've had experience with like older motorcycles and stuff like that, where if it's sat for a while, even if it's okay, sometimes it just needs to run a little while to work out some bugs. Assuming that, again, the pressure was good, the temperature was good. So that's what I tried. I ended up taking it to work the next day, which was a little bit longer one-way trip. When I got to work, there was smoke coming out from under the hood. So that was interesting. We'll come back to the smoke under the hood in a little bit. Some time goes on. I'm kind of, poking at the car here and there over the summer, because we ended up getting this running back in April of 2020. So it's been almost a year now. But I just kind of went back and forth with the car a little bit, try this, try that, little adjustments here and there. I ended up finding out that part of the reason why it was struggling to start was because the starter, I'm not sure if it was just the way that the cast was done now on the new starter, or if it was maybe I lost a washer or something like that. But apparently, one of the starter bolts was not in all the way, or it had bottomed out before it was actually putting pressure on the starter. So it was slowly rattling loose off of the engine block. And what I was perceiving as it struggling to start, as a dead battery, this, that, and the other, ended up being that the starter would eject the rod onto the flywheel, and then because it wasn't straight and because it was loose, it would basically just jam up. And so I was taking that as, the battery needs to be replaced, or, I need to try this, that, or the other thing. For some reason, it's just not, it must be locked up somewhere or something like that. Once I fixed that, I no longer had a problem cranking the engine. It seemed to be going okay at that point. So I thought that I had basically fixed the problem. I could get it starting now. It was running decent, although it never quite ran as good as it did that best pass that I had. And I never fully understood why, until we'll go back to the smoking part now. One night, I'm sitting there, and I had nothing better to do, so I was like, hey, you know what? It's a nice night. It's a nice, clear, good temperature night. I don't have to worry about my windshield fogging up or anything like that. It's clear skies, so it's not going to rain on me. I'm going to go tweak with the car a little bit and see if I can, get it running good again. I go out. I adjust the car a tiny bit, not too much, because the settings we had before, like I said, were doing really good. So at this point, I was just making teeny tiny little tweaks and then going for a ride up and down the road just to see if maybe that was it. I also played with the kickdown cable adjustment a little. It's hard to really explain without the visual representation here. But suffice to say, I was making tiny adjustments everywhere I knew how to. And it didn't seem to be getting, that good power back. So I was coming back from the last ride I was going to make for the night. And all of a sudden, I'm getting a lot of smoke, just a lot of smoke. And I notice that it's starting to overheat. So I pull in the driveway, and I just kind of pulled up the ramp in the driveway to the garage, and it just dies on me immediately. It is way too hot. I think it was at 2:30 or something like that, climbing though, even after the car died. It's pitch black except for the lights coming out of the windows in the garage. It's pitch black in the car, and I happen to notice a glow coming from one of the holes by the shifter setup, and I realize the car is on fire. So I run after a fire extinguisher. I get it all put out. I make a giant mess. It's So great. I don't even want to show you guys pictures of what it looks like right now because it's just disgusting. But I get the fire put out, and what I eventually find out is the problem is I'm leaking oil, and it's been soaking into my exhaust wrap, and once the exhaust got up to heat, it basically just ignited the exhaust wrap. Nothing like a little car fire at 1 o'clock in the morning. Nobody else is around, nobody else is awake or even knows what you're doing, and then your car's on fire in your driveway at 1 in the morning. If nothing else, the Nissan has certainly brought some excitement to my life. So I eventually figure out that the oil seems to be coming from one of the breathers in the valve cover. And I think at the time I still just had the cap on the driver's side valve cover and just a generic oil breather on the other side. So I think to myself, okay, there's too much pressure. I get the oil all cleaned off of the exhaust wrap so that it's not going to catch on fire again, save for a little bit burning off here and there. And I get a PCV valve to hook up to the carb, to the intake vacuum, because I read all over the internet that if I have too much pressure, it's probably because I didn't have a PCV valve hooked up. We initially were not going to have one just because it seemed like extra work that didn't necessarily have a lot of benefit, but I figured it was something I could pick up locally the next day. It was going to be super, super cheap. I ended up getting a better breather for the passenger side valve cover while I was at it, and I just replaced the generic cap from the parts store that I'd put on the driver's side with the PCV valve, hooked it all up, and cleaned everything up and tried going for another few test rides. It was at this point that the oil leak seemed to be getting better, but it was not going away. And I was pretty concerned, mainly just because of where the oil was coming out. It seemed weird that it would be coming out of the top of the engine, that there would be so much pressure in there that it was just coming out of every which way. And you've probably noticed by now that I've been trying to take the cheapest ways possible out of these problems because I'm trying to save money while I'm diagnosing and starting with the cheap stuff and working my way up. So it's still overheating. I'm thinking maybe it's the heat that's causing it, and that might sound dumb. I figured it was worth a shot, so I ended up draining and flushing my coolant a few times just with water. Once I was sure it was good and drained, I did get some old kind of rust flushed out of the system, so it was probably for the best that I did it anyway. I got it all filled back up with coolant, took it for a few more rides. The oil leak didn't really go away. It continued to overheat, and now it was essentially boiling coolant up the radiator, down the hose into the reservoir, and then literally just blowing the cap, like the little red plastic cap, off the reservoir. So at that point, I'd pretty much done everything that I could do for free or as cheaply as possible to try and mitigate these issues I thought I was having. So one day, I'm sitting there with my dad, and I'm explaining the symptoms to him, and he asked, "Are your coolant hoses getting really hard, like there's a lot of pressure in them, right away when you start the car?" Walk over to the car, start it up, and yeah, a lot of pressure in the hoses right away. So the new leading theory is that we blew a head gasket somewhere along the line. Enter my second engine gasket kit since I bought this car. So that's next on the list. We're going to do head gaskets the weekend of the 26th. I've already gone over everything with Dad. There should be plenty of time and availability in the garage between him and me and his customers. So it should definitely happen that weekend, so long as nothing else comes up, which it often does. So that's pretty much it as far as a general update on the overall status of the build. I did go over my previous videos though, and there were some things that I noticed that I never really talked about that I kind of wanted to just go over real quick because I said I would years ago and then never did. So I figured now's as good a time as any. So the first thing, and probably the most obvious thing that I never went back to, was the steering rack, because I said that we were not going to have the power steering. Obviously we haven't, because in all the videos up to now, there's been no power steering pump. Without getting into too detailed of an explanation, I'll explain basically what we did to make it manual steering, and I'll try to find the link to the forum post that I followed for this and post in the description as well. Essentially, we took out the steering rack, we took everything out of the drum on the steering rack so that we could free up the steering shaft, basically, that is inside the housing. And then through a series of brute force and prayers and just being super stubborn and not giving up, because we had already gone way too far, we ended up getting that pushed out of one end of the steering rack. I believe we ended up pushing it out of the driver's side. Don't ask me why. I'm not sure if it said it in the forum or not, but that was the direction we ended up going. Maybe if we went the other way, it would have been easier. I'm not sure. Anyway, we push it out, and there's like this center seal. It's just this solid piece of metal in a ring shape around the center of this steering rod. And what that does is it basically just separates one side from the other, so that when the pump is pushing fluid from one side to the other, it's actually pushing against something. And that's at least my understanding of it. This seal is what essentially creates the pressure and the vacuum inside the steering shaft that, when you don't have any fluid, makes it so hard to steer. So we cut the ring out of the center of the shaft and then stuck it back in, got everything all installed that we needed, and then just basically filled the housing with grease so that it would be lubricated, and now it steers freely within itself. It steers easier than if that seal was still in there and there was no power steering fluid. But when you're sitting still, it steers harder than if you were to have a power steering pump that was assisting the movement of those wheels while you're sitting still. Once you get rolling, it's really not that bad. It's mostly when you're going slower or when you're at a standstill that the steering is really difficult. One last little thing, and then I will end the video so you guys don't have to listen to me talk anymore, and then hopefully in the next couple weeks I will have a real substantial video out for you guys. And that is to talk about the carburetor. Basically, it's a 4-barrel Edelbrock 600 CFM carburetor. They're great, they're nice, and it's got an electric choke, no EGR, because obviously there's no EGR set up on the car. Anyways, one day I went to try and start the car. This was after I fixed the starter situation, and it just wouldn't turn over. I tried it a couple times, and then of course I have terrible luck with this stuff. So when it didn't work after a couple tries, I decided, you know what, I'm not gonna push it, right? I'm gonna go check the oil and see if there's anything obviously wrong with it. And it was about twice as high as it should have been, and it was clear, and it smelled like gas because there was gas in the oil. To this day, we're not sure what actual component is failing in the carburetor that is allowing all of that gas to go in afterwards. But we did find out that if I kept a pair of vice grips on me and just clamped that rubber fuel line between the steel line and the carb on top, and basically just let the car run out of gas, it wouldn't just load my cylinders and drain gas into the oil pan. So basically, I'm going to get a new carburetor. Obviously, we ended up getting the throttle hooked up, but I will wait to go into that until I have the car in front of me again, because that is a little bit more of a detailed process. I know I said that that was the last thing, but just one more thing real quick. It turns out your radiator fan is essentially a generator. So if you do what I did and essentially just hardwire your fan into your battery, it will be generating just a tiny little bit of power back into your battery, and by extension back into your distributor while it's spinning. So sometimes if you ran the car and you got it up to temperature, and the thermostat closed, and your fan kicks on. When you turn the car off, nothing happens. It keeps running for a minute because that fan is still spinning, feeding power into your distributor, lighting up all those spark plugs, and keeping it running. I've been told that the remedy to this is to simply put a relay on the fan, and that should stop the power from feeding back into your system. So that's also on the list, along with the carburetor and getting these head gaskets done. But I'm going to need to do a little more research. When I do that, there will be a video that includes it. But at the end of the day, it's been pretty cool. It's been a fulfilling build. I've learned a lot just about how the systems work and everything too. But anyway, that's it for another video. I'm sorry it was basically just me talking again. I know that's what these have basically turned into at this point. But hopefully me learning all this stuff more or less the hard way will help you guys as you are putting V8s in your old Nissans. Thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe and share with your friends and hit the notification bell and do all the things that you do on YouTube. If you're the praying kind of people, maybe say a little prayer for me as I do this head gasket thing in the very near future, like a week from when you're probably watching this video. Have a good one. Thanks for watching again. Bye.